Hello, welcome to another episode of Global Pearls Rethink the Future, a podcast dealing with our market-orientated way of life and the impasse this represents for culture. So in today's episode, we're going to be looking at the post-growth world, but essentially frame it from a transitional basis. So if we're beholden to growth as a way of life, so being market orientated and all the ways how government frames economic activity, it's always contingent. It's about ensuring that there's this perpetual kind of growth, which is just about consumption. Well, then how do you potentialize a post-growth scenario? What would be involved in order to achieve that? This is often touted, invariably around ecological kind of issues, but I'm going to broaden the scope of that movement and essentially but broaden in a way that doesn't really have anything to do with ecological issues, but has to do with our way of life and the spiritual deprivation that our way of life engenders. All right, so in that regard, but we still need to look at it in the context that we're market orientated and we are marginal in reference to life. And so because of that marginality, we have to look at change from the margins. So the margins here is that, well, how do you potentialize the possibility or the potential of zero growth or post-growth world in context being market-orientated? It seems like whenever this is framed, it doesn't give it any context as to the way how you can engender this as a how this would emerge. And so it's very light on detail. So one of the things which I'm going to detail out is actually grounded into a praxis. But before we do that, I'd like to explore this topic through the question that where does growth come from in a post-growth world? Now, the framing of that question, the way I'm framing it, is in the transition. So if we're potentializing a different way of doing things in order to get to a post-growth world, then literally to do things differently presupposes that we do things differently. So we're going to ground this into practicalities. But the opportunity here is the opportunity for the way how business and people relate and a different way of giving and receiving. And it's got to do with the way how you can engender the relationality beyond or your agency that's circumscribed to want to potentialize it to creativity. And that has a lot to do with the way how we can potentialize our time beyond the economic good. So that's the way how I always frame it in that context, because it's always the same thing. I'm just literally looking at the praxis from a different way, from a current, maybe a conversation that occurs now. But so we have to look at, well, why is growth given as somehow as a panacea for all the ills of maybe our collective existence? Why is it touted so much? Now, obviously, growth is a proxy for well-being. So, if the GDP numbers are increasing, then supposedly well-being is increases. I mean, it's absolutely absurd, because you can have within an economy or, a gross national product, you can have an economy can be producing armaments, and yet if you're producing more armaments and the GDP increases, then supposedly that's an increase in well-being. It's just the absurdist notion that's so circumscribed and limiting. But that doesn't necessarily mean to say that you could look at framing well-being outside that and do justice to human well-being, because it's an existential. So why is it, because in that regards, a GDP numbers are ultimately used as a justification, or are used for insight in order to manage the economy in inverted commas. So if you're looking at the way how we're going to somehow set up a way of framing well-being, does that presuppose that our well-being is managed? All right, so that's an issue, obviously, because you're not surpassing the managerialism that is endemic on the face of the planet when you presuppose looking at a way of doing justice in inverted commas to people's experience of their lives. Okay, there's ways that you have to see beyond that, I suppose, is what I'm really getting at. But it's ultimately, so if we're looking at it from the aspect of just growth, and so growth here is, the context here is not necessarily growth from an aggregate, but literally from, say, if you're an individual business, so you're looking at growing your revenue. If you're an individual business, you're looking at growing your profitability. There's all manners of kind of growth that can be related to the ultimate question or the overarching question about a post-growth world, because it does presuppose, if you're moving to zero growth or post-growth, that somehow that there's going to be a diminution or reduction in the growth of specific businesses. So that lends itself to the question about the orientation. But so in this context of why maybe we can say that we should be looking beyond growth as that panacea, as a way how we're framing well-being, well, is to consider that, our way of life is maybe not sustainable. And so if the sustainability issues invariably drives the degrowth kind of movement, and so because of that, it's beholden to like an ecological kind of frame of reference. So whether or not it is from the aspect of resource depletion or from ecological destruction or the undermining of the biosphere to support life, and through the wanton practices of our way of life, degrowth models, or what would then constitute a post-growth world, are very much framed like that. So we can say that, but that's not enough to explain, the ultimate issue here. So we can look at it because, like I said, if we're looking at a transition, we're looking at where. But all right. So the issue here is that our being market orientated, our wants are primary because money is a given, but money is a given only because, the preeminent good of our time reigns. It's the primary good that we're ultimately focused on is our time, but our time is an economic good. So, when you're considering the nature of our way of life is ultimately orientated towards our temporality or our experience of life, then there's no outside the claim that works on you. So our way of life is totalizing. So if you're looking at it from where can growth come from, it can't come from outside, obviously, that world that's beholden to growth, because there's no outside to it. So in that regard, it has to come from somewhere. And so one of the ways that we can explore the potential for action is to look at that somewhere in light of the fact that our way of life is totalizing. So in that regards, so it's not necessarily a where, but what. It's what. So the what is the relationality. Because the relationality here is in context to what it is. Well, what would that mean? So the relationality is obviously between people. So if it's between people, then the where is between, and the what is the relationality, and the directionality is through that is the directionality is a way is the way how this comes about, because obviously it presupposes an orientation or a direction, and so it comes from within, but it comes from the between. And the reason why this is important is that if you're looking at potentializing as a zero growth, but you're framing it, your understanding of what drives growth or degrowth as a model is this the really more materialism rather than the spiritual poverty, then you're not really going to be looking at the underlying cause of our way of life that has given rise to ecological destruction and crass consumerism and resource depletion, all right, and all these other things. So, and this is important for to frame our understanding that consumerism is a substitutable activity. So we need to explore why it is a substitutable activity, and if we can understand that it's predicated on a poverty of relating, well, then you'll understand that the in-betweenness is where the potentiality exists for degrowth to be given. But once again, the context here is that we're beholden to a market-orientated way of life, whereby that we're marginal in reference to the way towards life, because we accept our time as an economic good, and so we're preserving ourselves in face of the relationality that we substantiate every day, which is our want. Right? Our want is primary because money is a given. So in that context, the potential exists between people to create a way of sharing that would obviously lessen the substitutable activity of consumption, and by default remove a lot of the resources that are implicated in consumption as a legitimised activity, but then can be seen as a substitutable activity in light of the poverty of relating. All right, so this is the critical distinction here, is that then you're looking at it not from the aspect of ecological destruction or any form of kind of like materialist understanding of the issue, but you're looking at it from the spiritual aspiration of people. And this spiritual aspiration, why is spiritual aspiration important? Because our way of life is impoverishing, and we're beholden to essentially a spiritual disease. And so we really need to look at how that is implicated to then frame that emergence that we're talking about. So let's look at that. So let's go back and look at, so you've got two ways that we can frame growth. So one is just economic activity, all right? So economic activity, if you think that we're market orientated and all we have to do is, to be market orientated, what's it about? It's about monetizing your existence. So it's essentially just about engendering wants. So you create demand in order to supply. All right, and so therefore to meet the demand. But then if that recycles upon itself, then ultimately what you set in train is a holding pattern that feeds upon itself. Now the issue here is that is a growth. That is essentially the model for life. It's underwritten by the spiritual aspiration of independence, because if you're resolving upon your time and so you're trying to remove the claim that otherwise works on you, then you essentially are creating a supplement of time that you style. But the issue here is that when we are beholden to an unavowed utopianism, and so the context for an unavowed utopianism is that if our time is always an economic good and we determine the marginality of whether or not it is leisure or our labour, well, then there's no place for your time outside you. So there's no market for your time outside you. So if there's no place for your time, which is what I always say, then it's utopian. But the issue of this unavowed utopianism is that you externalize, all right, everything for the sake of that good, the preeminent good of your time. So that means to say that you substantiate a vision towards life that's very diminutive, which is essentially lifestyle obsession. But lifestyle obsession is the way how you share yourself in that publicness, or when you're beholden to that unavowed utopianism. So we're all doing the same thing. We're all orientated towards the same preeminent good. But as a result of that, because we're marginal in reference to life, we marginalise the places that we share because of that. Now, because we marginalise the places that we share, they become more opaque, and as a result of that, the good of visibility is engendered as a result of the marginality. Now, the issue here is that if everybody is orientated towards the same thing, and the way how that they share themselves is through the legitimised activity of consumption in order to differentiate themselves, because they're still orientated towards the ideal of independence. But the context here is independence. You only have recourse to the signs of independence, all right, or of sovereignty, as it were. So you are aspiring to a model that basically would embody what you consider to constitute sovereignty. But because you only have recourse to signs to differentiate yourself, and your want is primary because money is a given, the way how we have this acquisitive mimesis that is engendered, its spiritual aspiration only has recourse to the signs because we accept the world as a given when we presuppose money. All right, so you can only resolve upon trying to emulate something that you can never be, and as a result of that, you have recourse to the signs of that transcendence or sovereignty. But then you resolve, or you get into a feedback loop whereby you can't be what you presuppose, because to do that is to essentially to incarnate the exceptionalism, in your choices. Which, what would that be? Well, that would be looking at that, your want is only primary because money is a given, and our way of life, we just accept money as a given. It's a convention that we don't problematize in light of the way towards life. Now, if you're taking up the exceptionalism that you reserve for yourself as a sovereign, to make an exception, that means to diverge from one way of life to another. That's the starting point of any emergence from that would potentialize the relationality from want to creativity, and through that engender a way of sharing that would reduce the legitimized activity of consumption, because you wouldn't be having recourse to the signs of difference. Your difference would be the way how you embody that difference in your life with other people to create a common surpassing that you share. But if you're creating a common passing that you share, the relationality is what is the critical distinction here, because through the relationality, you're no longer relating to each other through your want of life, all right, and having recourse to the science to differentiate yourself through your consumption. It's about the way how that you have a richer experience with people, and so the intimacy of relating is strengthened as a result of that. And so therefore having recourse to the science becomes basically redundant or meaningless in the face of that relationality. So if you don't look at it in that context of that, then you're never going to understand that why consumerism or consumption is a substitutable activity. It's predicated on the impoverishment when we relate to each other through our wants. Okay, and especially being market oriented, because your want is primary because money is a given and wants can be engendered. And if wants are engendered, and it cycles upon yourself, and then you come into a holding pattern. And like I said, beholden to an unavowed utopianism mean to say that you externalize for the sake of that good, meaning that you externalize literally everything. All right, we're talking about the world, the earth, everything, because you value your time as a preeminent good. So this context is critical to understand the way how negative externalities that relates to our way of life can build up, and they're never addressed. All right, because they are the symptoms of a way of life. Ultimately, they're not the cause. The cause is the underlying cause is our way of life, but our way of life is predicated on a spiritual poverty of relating. Okay, so the context here is that if you're looking at, where does growth come from? So the growth here is the growth of community or culture or civilization, we can say, because it's basically a civilizing thing. It's about a greater good beyond your own time. But the issue when we're looking at it to potentialize a kind of transition to a post-growth world, growth has to be drawn off the current paradigm. So the way how you're framing post-growth literally doesn't come. It comes from engendering the relationality between people, right? So it's whether or not it's business to consumer, inverted commas, or people to people. So I always frame it that you've got to potentialize your time beyond the economic good that you receive it as. So that's looking at the marginality to become indivisible. But indivisibility here is a way how you can temporalize place. Temporalizing place is important because that's where you share. And through that sharing, you're creating a common surpassing that is to do with a way of life, engendering a new way of life, a different way of doing things, a different way of giving and receiving. So in that context, what are you doing? You're strengthening, you're growing something that cannot be reducible into any kind of metric, as it were, because we're talking about if money, and I always talk about this, money conceals goodwill. So to remove, if you're talking about post-growth and you're talking about the way how you're removing growth and the way how growth gets quantified, it gets quantified. So if it's getting quantified, but yet you're removing money, well, that would consider to be a diminution or a reduction of, say, gross national product, wouldn't it? So you would consider that actually well-being has decreased. But as a result of the engendering an ethos, all right, engendering culture, richer communal experiences, engendering a publicness that's not predicated on that is not beholden to an unavowed utopianism, well, the substitutable activity of consumption lessens, and as a result of that, you're seeing consumption no longer as a driver of the resource destruction and the negative externalities of production in that case. So why? Because you're creating an artful way of life. It presupposes that if production, commodities are produced because, we're looking at the way how you can, economize the factors of production, but in order to drive efficiency, you have to economize time, because you can economize time independent from the factors of production, just like you can economize your time independent from your wants. The critical thing here is that that's what drives the demand. All right, so to produce more, to maximize yield, to drive profitability. But if you're looking at a different way of giving and receiving, and you're literally looking at the way how you are going to remove want from the relationality, then you're going to be really looking at the necessities and the way how necessity becomes the mother of invention to create art, an artful way of life. Because then you're not beholden to marketing and branding and essentially the propaganda that underwrites basically all marketing and branding, that our way of life is unsurpassable. So in that context, growth comes from the opportunity that's not beholden to the market. So let's look at it in the context of an individual business to understand the way how this thing works. Okay, so you're looking at the way how that you're going to potentialize a person's time beyond the economic good. So that's the way how that they dispose of the relationality that is very much tacitly accepted when branding and marketing, the way how we know it, is a given, all right? Because the business is just orientated towards, so whether or not it's looking at the way how it can engage you as a person, it would like to say, but it's ultimately about trying to generate some kind of goodwill. Now, goodwill is this on a balance sheet. That's where it goes. If you're loyal, all right, to a business, all right, and that loyalty, that kind of brand advocacy maybe that you give, will land on the balance sheet of that business, and it will only get actualized maybe on the disposal of the business if it was ever to be sold. But the key point here is this is when you're generating some kind of enterprise value. All right. So and it's predicated on what? Your loyalty. Loyalty to what? Loyalty to the business, but also loyalty to the way how that you're approached only as a consumer. So to be approached as a consumer is to what? To suffer a diminution of your agency or your creativity. You're not given credit for creating the world. You accept the world as a given, and you're going to be addressed like that. So when you're looking at potentializing a zero growth or a relationality from want to creativity, it's the way how business would have to dispose of the way of addressing you to potentialize that relationality beyond the way how it's circumscribed when business only considers opportunities defined by market. This is why enterprise good is critical in this emergence, because it's the way how the goodwill that's otherwise generated in this kind of toing and froing, the practicalities of the way how this thing would work, is engendered beyond the business. Because if business takes their culture as an asset, all right, so therefore it's always looking at the way, and this is what business does. It's always thinking, okay, it's the culture. You can have strategic direction, but then it's a culture. It's the way how you're really getting people involved. Now, if they are because why? But even if you're looking at it from the aspect of that they're orientated towards an opportunity in the market, and then they're looking at the way that they can engage their employees in a manner that does justice to them as a person, that person that's employed by that business is still orientated towards the good of your want as a consumer, because they're there to basically to support or to the business in the opportunity that they've identified in order for them to look at you and to consider you as a person. All right, so the relationality of want is never engendered irrespective of all the overtures of business. All right, so the question here is that you have to overcome the dogma that is essentially just a given, because the relationality of want is a given. But if we're looking at it from the context of engendering a sociality beyond want to creativity, whereby you're doing justice to people as people, that people create the world, you're giving them credit for that, well, then it's the way how you can potentialize the relationality in order to engender difference that would manifest itself in the world where people are really engaged in that. But that's not an opportunity that's defined by a market. It's literally a greater good, or you're enterprising the good of another way of life, a different way of giving, the completely different ethos. So the context here is that when you're looking at the way how you can engender a form of a way of life that engenders a richer experience between people, what you're doing is that you are potentializing the growth of that business when people start to support the business, because then you're through the advocacy of people that if they were so to be engaged with something like this, then they'll be looking at the way how that they would support businesses in the overture, just like people now support businesses when they're aligning with their values. I always say that if you're aligning with your values, you're still substantiating the relationality of want. Even if you are a prosumer in inverted commas, it still substantiates the relationality of want. All right. So the issue here is why? Because business only considers opportunities defined by a market. So here you have the context of enterprise good, which is essentially the umbrella organization that all these other participating businesses that are all focusing on individual markets, but then what they're looking at is a way how that they can be orientated towards an opportunity that's not defined by their own individual market. So that's the way how you potentialize an ecosystem and an economy and a world, a post-growth world. But to initiate that in the current paradigm is to really set up two ways of doing business. So one that's going to be beholden to corporatism and managerialism, and one that's going to be open towards creating a dynamism within the culture. Why? Because culture is not beholden to the asset that business takes it for. It's just fucking not. And so all the bullshit that relates to whether or not it's managerial bloody consultants and all that bullshit, it's just not. You circumscribe it in a manner where you don't do justice to it, but then through that you limit the opportunity to engage in something far beyond the scope of what you're individually capable of as a business, because you're engendering a form of cooperation with other businesses and ultimately your customer base in inverted commas, but you're not considering them to as a customer base. You're really looking at the way he can potentialize creativity. Now, when you're doing that, like I said, you've got to temporalize. You've got to temporalize people's time beyond the economic good that they receive it as, to temporalize place. So temporalizing place is really critical for a common surpassing. Temporalizing place, why? Because that's where people share. So when people temporalize place, they're sharing, and through sharing, they're engendering a more intimate relation with other people. Okay, and through that intimate relation, then like I said, it doesn't necessitate the way of showing the difference. Okay, that is ultimately orientated towards, differentiating yourself through how much money you have, which is just, obviously crass. This is what it is. It's crass. And you can never live up to the lofty ideals of the sovereignty that you lay claim to as much as what you can. And I say there's little difference between a person that's always orientated towards their life as a means and a person that's uber wealthy and has all the money in the world and is just looking at the way how they can leverage their money towards power, to utilize the power that would represent, but to do what? The only thing that they can do is, maybe if they are so inclined, is just to perpetuate the way of life that's already given. If they don't potentialize their wealth in a way where they're going to potentialize in the mean of people's existence, then all they're doing is going to give strength to institutions or whatever that feed off the managerialism, because the way of life is just presupposed and is accepted as a given. But the context here is that the only reason why it's a given is because the no ones of the world that are given no credit for the way how the world is are given no credit, right? We just accept it as a given, and as a result of that, people presuppose that they can kind of manage it in the way that they see fit. But if we're looking at, well, how do you seriously take the aspiration of degrowth to potentialize a post-growth world, but then to give context to the way how that you're going to be engaging in business in a way that they can see an opportunity. All right, the opportunity might be a way of differentiating themselves, but once again, this is a critical distinction because it's a way of overcoming cynicism. The only way that you can overcome cynicism is that if the goodwill that the business would otherwise appropriate is given to the organization that manages it. That's why enterprise good is being made. It has been made so it holds businesses, if they're going to engage in this, a way of not taking the fucking piss and a way of kind of living up to it. If we drive more capability into the actual network, then what you're going to see is more capability basically to engender a difference. And I'll give you the way how this works further is that, let's say you've got a business that looks at the enterprise value. Say they belong to enterprise good, and the majority of the people that support the business are only there because it belongs to enterprise good. So the goodwill that would exist if they were to dispose of the business, the goodwill is primarily focused on actually what they're part of. So the enterprise becomes supplementary to the greater good that business is part of engendering within the culture at large. So the enterprise value, as far as the portion of the goodwill that will be attributed to the business, all right, as far as actually what it does, is lessened. Why? Because it's not beholden, but because it's a part or implicated or enmeshed in the culture. And so why? Because it's not usurping the goodwill through loyalty. The loyalty that would otherwise be to the business is loyalty to that way of life. Now, these are critical when you're looking at the way how you're trying to engender a post-growth. And post-growth is quantified through money, and we're lessening money. The only way you can potentialize the reduction of money is by looking at the goodwill that money conceals, right? And that literally looks at the way how you give and receive in a completely different way. Now, if you don't reduce it down into the nuts and bolts of that and the way how you can potentialize that, well, then all this thing is just going to be the aspiration of something, and nothing's going to be put in play. So why is it critical when you're looking at this from a transitional point of view? Let's say that you've got one side of the equation, you've got corporate bloody behemoths, right? And they only give a fucking shit about this. They just think it's just monetization. They'll have all the pretext to approach you as people. And here you have, and this is the way how I envisage it to work, is that you'll have all these small businesses that are creating like little kind of local eco clusters. All right, they all share the same thing. Okay, what's the same thing? Well, the praxis which I'm advocating, this is my dream, let's say, is that they have this common understanding of what they're doing. So you could have one that's in Austin, Texas. You can have one in Australia. You could have one in in Warsaw in Poland. You can have it wherever it is. You can have more. You'll have all these little things where what you're doing is that it's about community building. Now, business or big mass corporates, they'll always they always talk about it, but they can't engender it. They're beholden to managerialism. They're beholden to basically, they emulate the state. And you see this kind of convergence of interests. Right? Why? Because you're just, a way of life's presupposed. They presuppose that we're autistic beings, we're automatons, and that, people are going to be beholden to their screens, and we're just beholden to autistic exchange. And so to potentialize life beyond that is literally looking at the way how you can create a common surpassing, but you have to temporalize place in order to do it. But we have to understand the nature of the spiritual disease that we're beholden to, which is, like I always keep on saying, that unavowed utopianism that people can't even see. Because the question here is that if I say to you that your time being, if you're focusing your time as a preeminent good, there's something that's within that compromises your way towards life. Right? Most people would kind of rile against that and just disregard it. But the context here is that the spiritual aspiration is towards independence, and the only thing that you're ever doing is trying to remove yourself from the claim that otherwise works on you, that can leverage you, that can marginalise and compromise you, and you don't consider to step back that if you're resolving upon removing, say, dis-ease, and yet our way of life is a collective dis-ease, then how are you going to remove a way of life that's a collective dis-ease? You can only remove it collectively. So looking at it from the aspect of a transition, if you've got one way of doing things, potentializing community and richer experience within that community, how is any kind of corporate going to bloody compete with that? How are they fucking going to compete with that? If you're being approached not as a consumer, all right, but as a person with agency that is a co-creator, right? There's a key distinction here. Right? Because what you're doing is that you're setting up two ways of doing things, two ways of being. All right. One is just the way of life that's given, and then another one that potentializes life beyond the way how we accept for ourselves now. And that's essentially maybe the choice that we're going to be forced to kind of grapple with in the next few years or so, if there's enough people that listen to my bullshit. But who knows about that? Anyway, until next time, take care.